but he writes about it in such a way that this is for us, we only really want to go to restaurants that serve a reasonable range of natural wine. It doesn't have to be the entire restaurant portfolio, but we want to know that there's things that we can drink.
Yeah.
And we want a restaurant review to tell us whether or not that's the case.
Yeah.
But most of the restaurant reviewers don't seem to have got the ability to do that within the number of words that they're willing to devote to wine. You look at a Le Fooding review, and it's pretty formulaic, really. It's just a couple of sentences, and you can look at those and you can say, is this hardcore left, or is this middle of the range natural, or is this actually totally conventional, but they really like the food, so they've put it in anyway.
Right.
It's a real skill that it's not all that obvious at the moment in Australian restaurant reviewing.
And it's really strange, I guess, in the context of a dining experience. I guess obviously the culture of MasterChef has changed things a lot, and chef is even more celebrity, and this is something that I was talking about last night when we went to a loft, and my partner, she was saying, look, it's really interesting that they've got the bar set up here and the kitchen's essentially open. You can see it. I was like, well, that's actually a lot more popular now because people are so used to watching, cooking shows, and particularly competition cooking shows, to see that happening. I can't even remember what I was going to say. That when you are in a restaurant, when the food comes out, everyone's eating and they're talking about the food. Oh, what's your dish like? But in between the courses, you're enjoying the wine. You are talking about anything but wine a lot of the time, unless you're a wine person. Yeah, unless you're a wine person, or you're in the industry. A lot of the time you'll just kind of, I guess if you put yourself in the hands of the sommelier, they might suggest some stuff and you go, oh, this is a nice wine. But you'll talk about other stuff, what's happening in your life.
It'd be interesting to work out why that is, but I think a lot of it is because a lot of wine tastes the same.
Yeah.
And
that's
the wines that we're
true.
used to drinking, the wine that's like peaks and troughs of extremes. I don't mean peaks and troughs in terms of good and bad, just in terms of extremes of flavour, texture, colour even.
Yeah.
And we have lots of fun trying to match food and wine by colour. That's a good experiment that seems to have given us some really good results.
Yeah.
And so the wine experience is as exciting as the food, but because there's amongst a lot of the wine industry, you're all aiming for the same gold medal, then you do tend to make similar sorts of wine. So the differences are about the margin between 94 and 96 points. Sort of. It's not really interesting conversation.
Oh, well, I know what the margin is. That's New Oak. That's but it's interesting. The restaurant critics, and this is a worldwide phenomenon, but it's certainly the case in Australia. The restaurant critics describe the atmosphere in the restaurant. They describe the greeting. They describe the staff. Sometimes
decor, the music playing.
They always talk about the food, but it's the wine they most often leave out.
Yeah, it's almost like they don't even drink whilst they're dining.
Yeah. And there's also
quite bizarre.
And there's also this strange culture that's developed amongst some of the food writing in Australia or some of the wine writing and food writing in Australia about the fact that the wine lists are full of wines that no one's ever heard of.
Yeah,
because
that's a bad thing.
That the sommeliers want to hide the fact that the wine's what the markup is, and they'll be able to do that because no one knows what the wine is.
Yeah.
It's so cynical, and I wonder when that's written, if anyone, when they write that, has actually ever asked the sommelier why they have the wines that they have on the list. And all the sommeliers that we know in lots of really fantastic restaurants all around Australia, I could guarantee you that's the last thing on their mind. They're not choosing wines that are unfamiliar because they want to hide the price from the customer. They're choosing it because they think it's going to match the food and because they love the wine.
But also, I kind of think of it as, well, why wouldn't I want to take the opportunity to try and introduce something to people that they wouldn't have tried before?
Exactly.
And it's so funny because so often, again, you'll talk about a dining experience and go, oh my God, the construction of this dish, like I wouldn't have thought of putting that ingredient in there.
And that's a positive.
Or, oh my God, I didn't expect them to play, like late 80s, early 90s hip-hop music or, this really kooky, thing on the wall. But they never say that about wine. Wow, I had this amazing wine and it paired really interestingly and like in a way that challenged me in some way. That was so surprising. They don't talk about that sort of thing. They want the wines they know and they know exactly what they're going to get.
And there's a lot of I think the wine industry, and I'm talking about a lot of winemakers, I'm talking about wine writers, and I'm talking about wine sellers, that they grew up in the 60s and 70s, and that's where they still live.
Yeah.
And they want to be able to walk into a restaurant with their friends, and they want to be able to say, I know lots.
Yes.
And they want to be able to call a particular wine. And if they're now looking at wine lists and they don't see anything that they know.
I think it's both a question of I'm so confident with this wine list, but also I know nothing. I'm completely I don't even know, and they'll just go, oh, we'll just have a Chardonnay. And it's a shame that people. And I think that is largely a perception issue.
I guess the only thing is that if you do have a wine list that you know that most of the population isn't going to recognise, then it's so important to have good staff.
Yes,
with us, I mean, you work with Italian wines. When we go into a restaurant that mainly has French wines, we're comfortable because we spend a lot of time in France with working because of the nature of our business, and we know most of the regions. So at least we can see a lot of words that we recognise. When we go into a restaurant which is predominantly selling Italian wines or Spanish wines, it's much less familiar to us, and we're excited by that, but we are totally happy if we get a good sommelier and totally unhappy if we don't. If we can't explain, we can explain what we like.
Exactly.
In terms of, and it's not going to be grape varieties. It's going to be how the wine was made and how the grapes were grown that we're looking for, and we want someone to be able to understand that and give us something that matches those prerequisites. So, and if you get someone who's walked in, has been employed that day, and they're actually being trained on the job and they have no idea about the wine list, but they're not game enough to tell you and call someone else, then that's bad.
Yeah.
That's the downside.
And that really does come down
and that
to
does happen sometimes.
The skill and the experience of the sommelier.
So you need,
and their references.
If you're going to sell wines that you know that most people haven't heard of, then
you need good people
on the floor. And it's one of the reasons why in our business we've never really pushed our business to restaurants. We wait for a restaurant to say, "Oh, here you've got some French wines. Could I have a copy of your portfolio?"
Sure.
And then we'll mark it with the rest of them once we get that initial invitation. But we know our wines won't sell by just being listed. They're only going to be sold if someone knows what they are and is interested in what they are and can explain them to the customer.
Which creates some funny situations at times, because when we ask for a wine, maybe it's an oxidised wine or an orange wine, we sometimes get a sommelier coming over and saying, "Oh, look, do you really understand what type of wine this is?" Because we are aging and we look like
some
we're not
people
the sort of
might write about us in a newspaper story if we were hit by a car and say we were elderly, which is Roger says that's what would happen. I don't agree with that,
but we're certainly not in
these eccentric Tasmanians.
We're certainly not in the hipster category, and so they'll come over to us and say, "Do you really understand what you're?" And we say, "Yes, we're heavily into natural wines. We like oxidised wines, and we like orange wines, and they're not necessarily the same thing."
And provided they don't talk to us like a kindergarten teacher, then we don't mind that intervention.
But usually what happens, and this has happened in so many restaurants around the world, once we establish that connection with the sommelier, they go all out and they say, "Well, look, if you're into natural wines, then we'll open these ones." And
look, actually, this is not on the list, but it's something that
we went to a restaurant in California many years ago, and in the late 2000s, and the sommelier did exactly that. He came and asked if we really wanted that particular wine, and he said, "Look, how about you leave it to me for the night then?" And he ended up opening 16 bottles of wine.
All right.
And that was when we learnt about the first wines we ever drank from the Canary Islands in 15 years ago.
There you go.
It's like I describe it as a bit like a Mason's handshake, the whole international natural wine thing. It's such a wonderful community.
Yeah.
And it transgresses all frontiers. It's when you get into Europe, the boundaries that are being built up again now are not there with these wines, and it's really it's an associate. Whether you choose as a winemaker, as a vigneron, to be associated with that community, if you do, then you do join a community which is much broader than like with our French winemakers, there's more connection between a French natural winemaker and someone in Italy than there is between a French natural winemaker and a conventional French winemaker.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very it's so easy. You can do 1 degree of separation with just about anyone in the world.
I'm sure it's the same thing with you guys, but whereas the vast majority of wine consumers would be making the decisions based on region or based on variety,
Especially in Australia.
We base it on style, and obviously in a lot of cases the producer, because we might know that producer or we've heard about them, and we know that we kind of get an idea about what we're going to get, even though we might be surprised, and it's not what I expected, but it's still very, very interesting.
And it's funny in Australia that in the early days when we started importing wine around about the same time as Andrew Gard, and whenever we went to Sydney and we were presented with a wine list, we'd say, "Have you got any of Andrew Gard's wine?" we would choose our wine based on the importer.
Yeah, of course.
And so if we knew if it was
it's the same with me. Same with me.
Well, it's like in Australia, you still get all the time people say, "Oh, I only drink X, like Chardonnay."
Yeah.
But there is more difference between an Australian Chardonnay, a normal French Chardonnay, and some of the weirder French Chardonnays, or a Chardonnay from the Jura, than there is between a Chardonnay in Australia and a Riesling. It's quite. Chardonnay just has so many different expressions around the world.
It just doesn't make sense to say I only like the variety. Or I hate Chardonnay, or I hate
that's
Sauvignon
even
Blanc's
worse.
the great one. So many people who say to us, "I never drink Sauvignon Blanc," but we've got some Sauvignon Blancs that we love.
What's so funny, like when I think the real start of my career was working in a wine in the Yarra Valley, and at the time Chardonnay was, everyone was like, "No, Chardonnay, it's terrible, terrible, terrible." To the point where we would call people who came and said, "Oh, I don't like Chardonnay," as ABCs, anything but Chardonnay. Now that's sort of happening a lot more with Sauvignon Blanc.
Yes, that's exactly
And it's got
right.
nothing to do with the grape variety.
Exactly.
It's to do with the growing of the vine and how you choose to make the wine.
The variety is a component of the wine, but it doesn't define what the wine will be.
There's a reason why Sauvignon Blanc is a wine grape. There's something inherently good in the grape variety for it to have been used to make wine for so many years.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
It's just been
Sancerre has managed to survive for quite a while, growing Sauvignon Blanc only, and Pinot.
So, what were some of the really influential dining experiences that kind of got you more interested in the kind of wines that you guys, obviously love?
Well, one of the first times, and we
didn't know.
We
I
didn't
know
know
what you're going to say, and we didn't know.
We had no idea. But in 1985, we had to go to an IT conference in the United States, and Sue had this idea that we should go to this unknown restaurant in California that people were starting to talk about. So we went along to Chez Panisse. And Chez Panisse, at that stage, the food was all organic. So this is in 1985. And the wines were also, certainly some of them, were organic. And one of them was Domaine Tempier from Bandol. And we had that wine at Chez Panisse, and although we didn't know that it was natural at the time, we knew it was pretty special.
Yeah.
And but later we started drinking more and more wines that were in that natural camp. But it really wasn't until we walked into the Vert Volet in probably about 2003, 2004.
No, later than that, 2007.
Oh, okay. And
so when we were writing a story about Cave à Manger for Gourmet Traveller.
Yeah.
And we walked in at about 12:30 for lunch, and every single table had this bottle of wine on it, the same bottle. And it turned out to be...
It was a Jean Foyard Morgon. And we just thought, well, if everybody else is drinking this wine, perhaps we should too. There must be a reason.
There must be a reason, yeah.
And we drank it, and it was just so amazing.
And it's very interesting. You read so many stories about how people got into the sort of wine that we like, and they either happen at the Vert Volet or they happen with that wine. And because Foyard was one of the first people to really pick up Chauvet's ideas and make wine with minimal intervention.
Yeah. Well, I know that I'm sure a lot of people listening will, often when I ask people who, who love natural wines, was there a wine that sort of set them on that path, and then they might hear it and go, "Oh, I haven't heard of that one. I'll have to seek it out." as soon as they heard you say Jean Foillard, they go, "Oh yes, I completely agree with that," because Jean Foillard is one of the the really great well-known names.
And it was wonderful
as
to
far
see him in Australia for
Rootstock.
Rootstock.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, Alex's son was here.
Yes, Alex
for
was
a
here
long
everywhere.
time. A long time.
It seemed like a long time.
Yeah.
We like
Omnipresent.
Alex very much.
And I think Alex liked Australia too.
Very admiring of his ability to stay up all night.
But about at that time also, we were lucky enough with a couple of friends of ours to buy a house in Provence, and we'd sit there drinking wines, many of which were natural at the time, and
we didn't know that.
we didn't know. No,
we knew they were organic.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I wanted to know, how did you you kind of stumbled upon this and went, there's something about this we like, we're not sure what it is. Did you kind of go to people and say, look, we tried this one, really like it, can you suggest some stuff like it?
We're fairly, once we decide to engage in something, it's a fairly fast track.
Yeah.
I think
But there wasn't a common language in the mid-2000s about natural wine, and so people were just starting to get an understanding of organic and the whole natural fermentation and no fining or filtering, etc.
I think Nick Hildebrandt was about the only person that we're aware of who was really could. I think probably the first time I heard the term actually might have been from Nick, not someone in France, which is interesting.
Yeah, and so it was very early days, but by sitting in France and drinking these wines, our palates changed, and two things happened. One was the fruit-forward wines of Australia. When we'd come back to Australia after drinking savoury wines in France,
Textural wines.
yeah, textural wines, and we'd suddenly get these wines which obviously had been hanging on the vine for a lot longer in Australia, and more sugar, fruit
More
sugar
alcohol.
and
Much
more
more
alcohol,
alcohol.
and a lot more alcohol than what we were drinking in France.
And possibly a lot more alcohol than was actually written on the label.
Yes,
Which is frightening when you consider what was written on the label.
that's right. And so we thought, well, maybe what we should do is bring a few wines in from the area around our house, which was in the Ventoux.
We could see that as the only way we could afford to drink what we got used to.
And so we brought 2 or 3 producers in, and then
So that was the start of the importing?
that was the start of the importing.
2008, I think.
Right, okay.
And but very quickly after that, we realised there was this beast called natural wines being produced and was growing rapidly right through France. And so we made sure then that any new producers we got were completely natural, and the ones that weren't, we dropped off the list. And
Right, okay.
Over time, I mean, it's a fairly Catholic sort of collection. Our portfolio. It's for us, the fermentation has to be natural. The viticulture has to be organic,
absolutely has to be organic.
and that's about
at a
it.
minimum.
That's about it.
yeah.
We would never
No fining.
no fining, and generally no filtration. I think we've got some wines that get a light, particularly some of the light white wines get a light filtration.
Well, okay.
And definitely,
Just to stop you there, one of the big issues in wine is what the definition for natural wine is. So, and I think for me, the definition of natural wine is one of the most subjective things
Totally.
in wine. So I'm just interested to know what your definition of natural wine is.
That's relatively easy for us.
it's more a lowest common denominator
Yes,
definition.
it must be organic or biodynamic in the vineyard. No,
Yes. No additions.
commercial sprays in the vineyard whatsoever.
No herbicides, no pesticides.
And that's a
No
fair-
irrigation?
We don't have any wines that have been irrigated.
Okay.
In
But
France,
that
it's
just happens
allowed
to be
for the
that way.
first 3 years or 2 years.
Yeah, as far as propagation, of course.
But after that, most appellations in France don't allow irrigation, whether it's conventional or natural. So,
So that really hasn't been an issue for us because we only import wine from France. So it's kind of a given.
but certainly no sprays at all. And that's a philosophical thing, because what really struck us at about the same time we started importing was we were reading research which says that winemakers in France, or vignerons in France, sorry, have an 80% higher chance of dying from cancer than the general population.
And there's something terribly wrong with that when you consider that it's actually quite a physical occupation. You're getting lots of exercise, you're out in the fresh air, but you're more likely to die than someone who works in an office in Paris.
Well, I mean, I heard when I was travelling and visiting wineries in Europe, I heard stories about cooperative wineries, and chemical companies would come in and tell the growers, you need to use these chemicals, and not actually educating them, and they were actually throwing the chemicals with their bare hands.
Yes, that's right.
But the same thing has happened
insanity.
with just general agriculture, say in Tasmania. And
Just the lack of accountability is astonishing with some of
and
these companies.
pesticide use amongst vineyards in France is enormous.
So that's the first thing is they have to be organic or biodynamic. So
As far as the growing,
secondly, to be a natural wine, it has to be fermented naturally with natural yeast, the indigenous yeast.
So spontaneous fermentation with its indigenous yeasts?
Yes, absolutely. Because if you are adding yeast, you are adding, in most cases, you are adding foreign flavours to the wine.
Yeah.
And in fact, many of the yeast companies actually boast on their websites,
This will
buy
give
our
you,
yeast and you will get tropical flavours,
Yeah.
you will get guava and
Yeah.
so on. So it must be naturally fermented.
Mm-hmm.
No additions, so no DAP or no fish bladders or no
And no
egg
high
whites.
tech reverse osmosis or any of those sorts of gadgety things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so no additions, no high-tech stuff, and so no fining, because that's adding foreign substances to the wine,
So
which
no
you
bentonite.
can't. No bentonite,
Yeah.
no egg whites, none of those things.
What about filtration?
Filtration? Some of our winemakers do a very, very light filtration, but
Because
most do settling. They just leave it in the tank until
that's
it
the
settles.
thing. Like I actually think of racking as a form of filtration. Like a lot of the wines that I represent, they disagree, but I think just through gravity and maybe a little bit of natural temperature control, that allows solids to sink to the bottom, and then you take the wine off the top of that. That for me is a form of filtration, but it's a traditional. It's a
A
classic.
filter usually requires some sort of sieving
Yes.
to filter something.
Yeah.
You
So
need to put it
natural
through
settling, I think, is fine.
Yeah.
That's good.
But now you're starting to get into the fine edge.
Sure.
Yeah.
And as far as
And then the
SO2,
last thing is it could be the first thing in Australia, because normally sulfites are added at the beginning of the process to kill the natural yeasts.
Okay.
We're not sulfite Nazis. We do have wines that have small amounts of sulfites added to them. We do have a lot of wines which have no sulfites at all.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at where our portfolio's gone over time, it's gone more and more towards wines with no added sulfites.
And have you found that producers you might have worked with have also kind of pulled back on the amount of sulfites
Some have gone down a path where, when we first started, like Domaine Milan in Provence is a classic example, where when we first started working with them, they use sulfites in all of their wines, low levels by Australian conventional standards and French conventional standards. But now Henri Milan loves drinking wines without sulfites. So he started to make some for himself, and now more and more of the portfolio is no sulfites.
Yeah.
So he still keeps some of the wines that there's a classic white wine that's one of the wines that the Domain is known for. That is at the moment still made the same way, but probably I would say by the next vintage that will have gone as well. So he's gradually gone totally away from sulfites. I guess the other thing is, and we have some wines that are made with new wood, but that's like, I don't know, at the moment there's maybe 250, 300 individual wines on our list, and I'd say maybe 3 or 4 of them have seen any new wood, and I can think of only one wine we've got which is sitting, waiting. We haven't released it yet, and we've only got 12 bottles, which is made in 100% new wood. And there's no way we would sell it at the moment because it goes against everything we believe in.
Sure.
Because wood is an additive.
Yeah.
New wood is an additive.
It changes the expression of the vine and the soils.
So it goes against the minimal intervention.
So basically we want low sulfur, like 10 milligrams or 20 milligrams maximum in wine, or none. But one of the things about no sulfur is you have to be a very good winemaker, and you have to really understand
Well,
the winemaking process.
And you've got to be a very good vigneron too.
That's
Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
To not use sulphur, because you have to understand when the tannins have got to the stage where they are acting as a preservative, because it's the tannins that preserve the wine.
And you've got to
if you don't use sulphur.
And you've got to work with really good grapes. And
That's
and
right.
if you've had a difficult year, you've got to go through rigorous sorting to try to get rid of the grapes that may put the wine at risk when you're not using sulphur to protect it, because sulphur is a great risk reducer. And we don't have any issue if people want to. If people are making a living and they don't want to put their living at risk, and they see not adding sulphur is putting their living at risk, I can understand why they do that. But just that we don't particularly want to drink those wines. I now find it really hard to drink most conventionally made Australian wines, and it's a shocking thing that this has happened. But there's just too much sulphur. My body just says no.
Or sulphur and new wood.
It's trained. Well, it's trained to rebel against it because we don't ever drink it. And of course, the other benefit is that we just don't get hangovers.
For me, filtration is the biggest issue that I find. I am so tired of finding wines just too clean that they are devoid of any real expression.
Yeah, it's like stripping out all the interest.
I remember reading, I think it was Alice Firing's second book, and she talked about meeting someone at UC Davis. And I can't remember if he was one of the professors or if he was a winemaker himself, but he talked about doing all these things that he could then filter out or he could extract in some way. It's like, well, why add them at all? It's like, well, that's just the way that you do things. I find that to be totally abhorrent. Like
it's crazy.
And this is something that I talk about, that when you take something away, when you are filtering or not allowing a vine to find its own balance with the ecosystem and build up its own protections, you then need to replace that with something, and that might be more SO2, or that might be, or you might have to, do something that hides flaws, and that to me again is totally abhorrent. I can't, and so more and more I just want to taste wines that, for lack of a better word, are alive.
It's interesting that this idea of having a clean, clear wine has come about because of wine shows in Australia, where marks are allocated for cleanliness, clarity, and it's just such a stupid thing, because it has nothing to do. What it's doing is it means you have to take stuff out of the wine, and you're changing the flavour of the wine.
We find that people really understand, people who aren't obsessed with wine but are interested in having a conversation about what all this means if we talk about honey. Because most people understand the difference.
Mike Benny talks about juice, apple juice in particular.
Yeah, but and that's a good example. Yeah, but and honey is the same, where you can see it. It's so visual, the difference between a really clean honey that you might get in the supermarket, where it looks perfect, it runs
easily, yeah,
and you can see through it. It's clear,
and it doesn't go hard when you put it in the fridge. And something that's
raw, where that's been just been produced without any chemical, without any heat, then, and there'll be bits of pollen and maybe some bees' wings and a few other bits and pieces in it. But most people who are interested in eating well know that is better that is more delicious, and it's also better for you than something that's highly extracted.
That's what nature's given you.
Exactly the same thing applies to wine. I mean,
it's strange.
We're
so
just
strange.
so convinced that, and you talk about with yeast, you talk about the difference between true sourdough bread, which is made from a natural ferment, and not the sourdough bread you get at the fast food places that say it's sourdough, but it really isn't. And commercially made bread where you add the yeast, and you think when you eat a slice of a true sourdough bread versus a slice of commercial white bread, when you put it in your body, you know one is good for you and what the other one isn't. You can just feel the difference between the two things, and it's exactly the same with wine.
And people talk about, obviously with food, about how a product that hasn't been commercially produced, your body is better able to break that down.
Yeah.
Like, why would you feel any differently about, you know, an alcoholic beverage that you happen to put in your
there
body?
seems to be a lot of evidence with things like with a natural fermentation, you get fewer of the amines like histamines.
Yeah.
And when people say that they react to sulfites, who knows what it is that they're reacting to? Because there's so many things that you can legally add to a wine that don't go on the label, and so many people
Exactly.
hear people saying, "Oh, I'm allergic to sulfites. I can only drink white wine,
Yeah.
not red wine." And you look at conventional wine, and there's always far more sulfites in the white wine
Yep.
than the red
Exactly.
wine.
Or the argument they make, or the example they give is like, do you have any idea how much sulfites are used in dried fruits?
Yeah, but of course,
there's all
with
these other-
dried fruits is a really bad analogy, and it is one that the
It's the
commercial
common
industry- Yeah, that's right. But the reason why it's a bad analogy is that in dried fruits there's no alcohol.
No.
In wine,
Yeah.
there is both sulfites and alcohol.
Yeah.
And your liver thinks that sulfur is a worse poison than alcohol. So it processes that first,
Yeah.
which means the alcohol stays in your body longer, which means you're more likely to get a hangover.
Well, I do love the great story about the origins of the natural wine bar in
from
Paris. that the reason they wanted to drink more of those wines is because they didn't want to have to suffer the big hangover the next day.
And we have tested that hypothesis to almost destruction. And
It's really hard to
never
get a
get a
hangover
hangover.
unless Matt Young's here and we drink sake. So.
And as far as when you were importing, particularly these slightly more esoteric wines from France, did you find that the history that you had with Food Tourist, and cataloguing Australian restaurants, did that help you guys as far as selling the wines into the restaurants?
That's a good question. I think actually we're the best in terms of how we got to know restaurants outside Tasmania, because the majority of our wines are probably sold in Melbourne and Sydney. In the early days, I think we actually have a lot to thank Luke Burgess from Garage East, because Luke and Katrina and Kirk, the restaurant that they set up in Tasmania in 2010, was probably the first restaurant that was entirely natural wine in Australia.
Yeah.
And we went through this process of learning about these wines a lot together.
Right.
And people came to Garage East, and we met a lot of restaurateurs from interstate because they came down here. We met sommeliers.
So Garage East was like a real destination for people.
absolutely, yeah.
I remember meeting.
It was certainly the first totally natural wine list in Australia.
And so in the same way that they were coming down to discover this amazing cuisine that Luke was putting out, they kind of at the same time happened to be introduced to all these amazing natural wines.
Sommeliers would come.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how we met Matt and Linda from Black Market Sake. They came to show wines before Garage East opened in 2010.
Have you found that since
Richard
then
Hargraves and Annalise, we met them because they came.
Have you found that since then chefs have become a lot more interested in the wines as
Yeah,
well?
I think
in many cases,
chefs like the flavour of natural wines. They
Yeah.
like the savouriness. They
Okay.
like
And
they like
think
some
it
of
goes
those
well with their
oxidative
food.
characters that. Like in the Jura wines, you get so much umami, which is
exactly.
so attractive.
And they love umami themselves.
Yeah,
exactly.
So why
I
wouldn't they
think
want
often
to
it's
drink it as
chefs
well?
that are pushing. Sometimes it's the chefs that are pushing.
Yeah,
the
of
restaurants.
course.
We used to have this. A couple of funny experiences where it was restaurants where the chef was ordering our wine. There was a wine buyer who would buy all the other wines, but the chef would make sure that there was some of that.
You have to have this on because
And then there was a classic example in the early days of the Duke, in Sydney, where all the pet nats that we bought from Philippe Bonnard before there were any pet nats really in Australia, they all went to the Duke and they were all eaten, or they were all drunk by the kitchen staff, by Mike Eggert and Tom and all these, and Mitch. All these chefs were drinking the pet nats.
It's pretty funny actually. Just last year at Rootstock, I found that the most fervent people at the event were chefs rather than sommeliers.
Well, and this is something that a lot of people overlook, and it was certainly the case in Tasmania with Garage East. The people who were puzzled by Garage East, in many cases, were winemakers from Tasmania.
Sure.
But it's because chefs who go out of their way to source clean, organic produce, they naturally want to have wines that meet that same philosophy.
Yeah.
And
In the
that's
same way
what-
that they look at a plate and they can see those ingredients and they can taste it in their mouth.
That's right.
They want to know that what I'm putting into my glass, I can feel like it actually is, expressing where it's coming from and what it's made from.
And a lot of it comes down to what you were saying right at the very beginning of this conversation about the MasterChef and all those programs have educated people so much more about food, but wine has stayed in the same place.
Yeah.
Wine really hasn't. Not a lot has changed in terms of what people know about wine. The majority of people know about wine now compared to what they knew 15 years ago. They still like Chardonnay, or they don't, or they like Sauvignon Blanc, or they don't, or frighteningly, they are red wine drinkers or white wine drinkers, which is a completely incomprehensible thing to me.
Here's the big difference. Wine businesses, wine companies are much, much bigger than any kind of chef's influence might be.
Yeah, I know that.
Absolutely.
That's a really good observation.
Big wine companies,
Don't want anything to
they're the
change.
status quo. They don't want anything to change. So they're going to do whatever they can. And we all know what they're like. They kind of go, orange wines or no SO2 or not filtered wines, they're faulty. And I still have people saying those kind of wines, you open them, they fall over, in a couple of hours, which is the opposite. It's totally
some will
outrageous.
last for days, and
Exactly.
some you need to drink them within an hour. It's just the nature of the wine. And
But we've also had 25-year-old natural wines when we go to visit our
They
producers
don't
in
age.
France.
What an outrageous assertion to make.
Stupid, yes.
It's so stupid.
It suits the big companies to say
and
that.
and also the really sad thing is, I feel really, I don't know what the answer to this is, but I think that whatever criticism we may have of some of the restaurant writing because it doesn't get into wines enough, at least the restaurant writing traditionally in Australia, the writing about restaurants has been well funded by the owning institution.
Yes.
So I noticed that John Lethlean said today that he spends $50,000 that the Australian spends $50,000 a year, I presume he means, for him to eat in restaurants. So that's a big budget. The wine writers, from what I can tell, don't get anywhere near that budget because they don't have to, because the wine comes to them.
Yes.
And you see photos
But at the same time, they're not paid in the same way, and a lot of them will say, I can't completely rely on, my wine writing to survive.
But there's no...
And that's what Sue is saying.
In the restaurant, there's still this culture that says that if you're going to write about a restaurant, you should be independent. And you should make your own decision about which restaurant to go to. And if you're in the classic way of writing about restaurants in Australia and in America and in the UK, in France with Michelin, you will go to the restaurant several times. Someone will fund you to go to the restaurant several times before you make the decision. There's money.
Or someone else might be sent to, confirm what you might have said.
But with wine, there's no need for that budget because the wine is always just comes in. And as you say, the wine industry is very big, and the wine industry will do the education programs.
And the bigger the wine business, the more they can afford to,
right.
allocate a marketing budget to send samples
little
out.
importers like ours, and we just don't do that. I mean, we can't afford to, and we choose not to. We're not going to send wine on a
unsolicited
to a wine writer. If someone asks us for something, and there's a reason why they're asking for us, we'll bend over backwards to help. But we're not going. We just can't. I mean, we're really lucky because Windsor Dobbin in Tasmania is a wine writer, and he gets lots and lots of samples. And every now and again, we go down to his house at Cygnet and into his back shed, and we get all the boxes, which we use for all our 1, 2, and 3 boxes. And he's got a shed full of sample boxes. It's unbelievable, and it's still breathtaking. And I look at that and I think, there's no way that we could do that.
Yeah.
And so all these interesting wines that all the small importers, and it's really a big cultural change what's happened with so many people like sommeliers who might bring in a small portfolio of wines, and there are lots of little people like us, but those wines are not going to become part of the general conversation. It's only going to be a few people. Like what you're doing is really important with this program, and Mike Benny and Max Allen. There are people who seem to be interested and want to write about these wines.
But personally as well, not necessarily, because it's expected of them as a wine writer. They are personally, invested and interested in these kinds of products.
And some of them just don't lend themselves to the traditional way of writing about wine, where you give them a score and
Absolutely,
because they're off. It's like trying to analyse two.
And that's one of the things the wine industry hasn't caught up with. When you hear them talk about the sommeliers or the natural wine movement and how it's something being imposed by the sommeliers on the public who are seeking out natural wines, they are doing it because they're interested in something different.
Yeah.
And we've been going to these wine shows and the public tastings for, coming on towards 10 years now. Not one person out of hundreds and hundreds who flock to these shows has ever asked us whether any of our wines has a gold medal. They are not the slightest bit interested in the show movement or anything else. They're interested in the wines for their own sake.
They're interested in the story of the wine. And events like Handmade, it's coming up for its third year in Melbourne next weekend, and Mental Notes in Sydney the other day, and the granddaddy of them all, Rootstock. These are... And now we've got one in Tasmania in June on the 19th. I can give a plug for this.
That's at Franklin, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so exciting.
I just saw that.
Heaps of some of the most interesting Australian winemakers are coming. And,
but once again, that'll be a sellout. And it's the public who are asking to go to those things. It's no imposition.
Do you know what the big difference is? Is that from the producer to the consumer, everyone is connected.
Yeah.
That's
Whereas in the commercial sense, a wine producer, like you have your grape grower, then you have your winemaker, then you have the marketing and sales team, then you have the distributor, then you have the retailer, and then you have the consumer.
Or you have the sales rep selling to the restaurant.
Exactly. And how connected is the final consumer with the original producer?
So in our case,
totally
it's
disconnected.
1 degree of separation.
So that is the really important collaborative element, is that we're not competitors. We are all supporting each other. We are all supporting this, this part of the industry. Whereas the big wine companies, they think of other wine companies as competition.
That's a really good observation.
And when we walk into a restaurant with our wines to show them our wines, they know that we have sat in the kitchen of the winemaker and tasted their wines in their home. Yep. And it's a direct connection, and we know the stories.
And you go into their restaurant and you'll buy wines of other importers and other local producers, and they know that this is part of a community.
It's a community, and we're all wanting to educate everybody.
Exactly.
And we all share the same goals. And it's true in France. We don't know the culture in Italy, but I imagine it's very similar. But the community of the producers in France is fantastic. They're all wonderful friends. And I remember... one of the first tastings we did was in the room next to the gallery next to Cumulus with
Arc One.
Yeah, at Arc One with Giorgio de Maria and Andrew Gard and Matt and Linda with their sake, and I remember looking at Andrew was pouring Thierry Puzelet's wines and we were pouring Hervé Villemard's wines, and those two people, they run events together.
Yeah, and
I just loved it that we were doing the same thing. Yeah. Representing their wines side by side,
and it's that connection
as friends and colleagues in Australia. It's
they have lunch together once or twice a week.
Yeah,
too.
it's kind of it's we're trying. I think we're representing the philosophy of what they of them here.
And if we weren't all so busy and a little bit further away, whether we're in Hobart or Sydney or wherever, I'm sure that we probably would all be the same. But look, whilst I've been down in Hobart, it has been really lovely sitting down with you guys. And I know we've spoken before at various events and stuff like that, but it's great to be able to sit down with the recording device here and have a chat about these things. So I really do appreciate your time.
Thank you for what you do.
It's my pleasure. Look, as far as website and social media accounts, if you'd like to share with the listeners how they can
the
keep in touch
website
with
is
you.
livingwines.com.au, and because we're not really good at marketing, the Instagram and name is Food Tourist, not Living Wines.
Yeah, wonderful food, and wonderful Instagram account, I must say.
And the Twitter account is food_tourist, and the website for our restaurant guide is foodtourist.com.
And Facebook?
Facebook is Living Wines. Facebook/Living.
Fantastic. And look, I look forward to catching up with you again in Melbourne.
Yes, we'll see you next weekend.
At Handmade.
Yeah, we look forward to it.
Guys, thank you very much for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And of course, thanks again to Sue and Roger for their time and for opening some wine for me whilst I was in Hobart. You can, of course, follow me on social media. You'll find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Intrepid Wino. And also the podcast is on Twitter at the Vincast. Come to the Intrepid Wino YouTube channel and you can watch some of my Let's Taste videos where I open and talk about Australian wine. And always, please do subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Player FM or Stitcher or any other podcast hosting app. And that way you'll get the new episode as soon as it becomes available. And it's a really great way for you to share your impressions of the podcast by leaving a rating and review. All the information is available at intrepidwino.com, so do come pay me a visit, and you can see some of my writings and some other videos that I've posted. And why not get in contact with me, thevincast@gmail.com. Looking forward to you listening to next week's episode, but until then, bye.